I see some familiar faces here.
You turn it off.
Yeah. Can you
Would
guys?
everyone mute yourself? And I'm going to go through and
Can you see my screen, everybody?
yes, we've got it. You've got the whole thing up. You may want to go to slideshow.
Okay, that's where I am. All right. So recently I published this book at McFarland, and if you want to buy a copy of my little book, it's best to go right to the publisher, McFarland up in Jefferson. And it's been a long time working on this project, and I guess there are many reasons I did this book. As Dr. Clausen knows, I was hired at ASU in part to be a public archaeologist and to engage with the public. And I've done that over my 30-year career. Had lots of meetings with local artifact collectors and given lots of talks to Rotary clubs and high country lifelong learners and so forth. And I realized that people around here didn't have much of an idea of what happened here before Daniel Boone. And who knows what kids are taught in the elementary public schools around here as far as history. I'm sure it all begins with Daniel Boone. And so not much is known about that foggy past of the Native Americans who were here before the Euro-Americans. And also people have ideas like, well, you know, this is where the Cherokees lived. And actually, in most of my research, in all of my research, I've discovered that that's actually probably not the case. But I thought, you know, it's time to write something that sort of summarizes everything I've done in my 30 years here, plus what my colleagues, contemporaries, and predecessors have done in this region. Bring it all into one little package that anybody could enjoy, especially something that doesn't cost too much, with lots and lots and lots of cool pictures. So that's my book. And when I was writing this book, it seemed like I was writing a book about tourism in the high country, because this has always been a place of seasonal visitation for most of the human past. And, you know, there's a reason for that. Of course, today people come here seasonally because it's such a great place to be in the summertime. And if you're a skier, it's a great place to be here in the wintertime. There are hardly any mosquitoes here, virtually no gnats. Up until a few years ago, we didn't even really have ticks, but that's all changed with climate change. But tourism in this region goes way, way back in time. And that's pretty much what my talk is about today. So what I want to do is start in the present and work my way back through the past. Well, how do people get here today? A lot of the migrants, seasonal migrants, come up Route 321/221 from Lenoir, from the southeast into the mountains. Some of them come up, you know, 105 from the south, and a few of them come from the north, not too many, and from the west. But these highways now that we have numbers for and names for are the main inroads to the high country. And these highways actually map onto earlier roadways with a little bit of adjustment. Some of them have been widened, some of them have been moved uphill a little bit. And most of these major roadways also follow river systems and follow earlier trails. One of the earliest maps we have that sort of addresses our region is the Jefferson Fry map of 1751, a survey map that was done by, I believe, Thomas Jefferson's father to establish the line between North Carolina and Virginia. And in the red circle there is approximately where Boone would be located. And they were sort of guessing when they sketched out the mountains, of course. It looks like some weird stitchery there, embroidery or something. And they have a little bit of confusion with the convergence of the headwaters of Yadkin, Catawba, and New Rivers. But this was an attempt and one of the first depictions of the region. This is that same location mapped onto a more modern map. But what I want to focus on here is the river systems. It's well known and even mythologized in some ways, and plays roles in people's religions, that the Boone area is at the headwaters of the Watauga, of course, which flows out into the Tennessee ultimately, the Yadkin River flowing down to the east and southeast, and the Catawba River system heading to the south-southeast. So there's a convergence of headwaters here in part of the highest part of what I call the Appalachian Summit. And I got that term from Alfred Kroeber in 1939. He labeled it that in a study of the cultures of the southeastern United States. So, and here's just with these river systems sort of photoshopped on so you can see how they all converge in the area of Boone. So all river systems lead to Boone. And of course, the earlier pathways that became the roadways, that became our highways, they basically follow, many of them follow these river systems. It's the path of least resistance to get into the mountains. And those roads and those paths, those roads are following paths that probably have existed for thousands of years. Originally, they were, at least before they were roads, they were wagon trails. Before they were wagon trails, they were simple pathways, footpaths, and animal paths. And a lot of people think that, well, these were probably made by the buffalo. Hence, you have little signs around here saying Buffalo Trail Crossing and place names like Buffalo Trail this, Buffalo Creek, Buffalo Mountain. Actually, buffalo, or the American bison, were probably not in the Appalachian region until after AD 1750. And that's when there were a couple of sightings of buffalo on these trails. And so they got called buffalo trails. Well, the buffalo were probably just using trails that had already existed that were created by humans, other animals, and may even go all the way back into the Ice Age. So I want to do this tourism study or talk by going back in time. So some of you are old enough to remember the Bullwinkle show and the Wayback Machine, Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. So we're going to go way back to 1751 when that Jefferson Fry map was made. And that is also when Bishop August Spangenberg, the Moravian, and his small group came up into the mountains in search for lands for the Moravian missions. And he didn't find what he wanted up here, but he did down in the foothills ultimately. And this happened on December 3rd, 1751. And various researchers have tried to figure out which route Spangenberg took to come up into the high country and where he passed through. Some estimates place him coming up what is now called the Globe Road, which is sort of parallel to modern day 321. 321 replaced the Globe Road. And coming into Blowing Rock and then ultimately possibly into Boone and at the headwaters of the New River. Now this is December 3rd. He wasn't a very smart seasonal migrant coming up at that time, especially since that was during what we call the Little Ice Age. Now Spangenberg probably followed pathways. I doubt he on his horses and his buddies were just sort of blasting through the woods. They undoubtedly found pathways to follow, and even further down off the mountain, they refer to places like Indian Old Fields. So they must have seen what was a prior settlement or garden area or clearing that they called that. And they would have followed these pathways that parallel the river systems. And this one, of course, parallels the headwaters of the Yadkin River coming up into Blowing Rock, and then along this Johns River, and then into Boone, where you might pick up the middle fork of the New River. And again, this happened during what we call the Little Ice Age. Now, it wasn't an ice age in the sense that the glaciers advanced and everything was freezing and the mammoths and the mastodons were running around. No, this was just a slightly cooler trend that lasted for a couple hundred years, from about 1350 until, well, in fact, until the Industrial Revolution. That's what brought the end to the Little Ice Age. Otherwise, we might still be in it. And right now, sometimes it seems like Narnia in Boone, but it's not too bad. But so he was right smack in the middle, or maybe towards the end of the Little Ice Age, just prior to the Industrial Revolution. And it was significantly cooler, at least enough to affect human life in the mountains. And that's probably why Spangenberg, when he got up in the uplands near here, he recorded having seen no humans and no evidence of humans. There were no Native Americans to be encountered by Spangenberg in these higher elevations. They had moved probably by about 1400 to the lower elevations where they could have successful crops and village life. And then prior to Spangenberg, going further back in time, Hernando de Soto made a trip through the mountains, probably not through Boone, but not too far south of Boone, leading from Jowara or Shwala, the town at the headwaters of the Catawba River in what is now Burke County, North Carolina. And now we call that archaeological site the Berry site near Morganton, where Dave Moore at at Warren Wilson College has been doing some research and found evidence of Spanish habitation at that site, dating to the mid 16th century. Well, Hernando de Soto ascended the mountains and arrived in the higher elevations on May 26th, my birthday, 1540, not my birthday. And his people that were with him kept notes of their travels through the mountains. And one of them recorded that when they got there on May 26th, they were freezing. They were extremely cold. And this, I mean, that's practically summer, right? But this was during the Little Ice Age. So Hernando de Soto was the first Floridian migrant to the mountains because he came from La Florida, the Spanish colony. So I couldn't resist. I found this back of a De Soto car and I put this Florida tag on here with Photoshop. Sorry about that. And one of the most recent reconstructions of De Soto's route has him coming up from Jowara into the mountains and again following trails because De Soto had 600 men, 300 horses, a herd of pigs, and a bunch of mastiffs, war dogs. They weren't just wandering through the woods. They were following existing trails that had been made by Native Americans and animals and maintained for millennia. So they took the path of least resistance. And a recent study by Katie Sampeck and others using GIS and least cost analysis, they predicted that De Soto's group went through what is now Elk Park, and then therefore following what is now Route US or North Carolina 19E. So again, these pathways paralleling what are now, or preceding what are now highways, until ultimately De Soto and his group wound up along the Nolichucky River and down the Holston and Tennessee River, or Holston River to Chiaja. The Little Ice Age was the time when the Viking settlements were abandoned, and they had been established earlier in the 10th and 11th centuries AD. The Vikings had made it into Greenland and Newfoundland and established settlements, but they didn't last long because the Little Ice Age came on and they were living at a latitudinal threshold where, just a minor change in temperatures, a slight truncation of the growing season would have threatened their existence. So these settlements were abandoned. People were probably starving and dying during that little ice age. Well, going further back in time to AD 1000, this is during a warming trend, the medieval warm period. I know this looks a little bit like Al Gore's graph, because if you look over there to the right, when this thing was made in 2004, the line is going off the chart. But this, I forgot to mention that this temperature estimation is based on various proxies for temperature, oxygen isotopes, tree ring data, and I forget what the colors mean, but they all show the same sort of trend, a warming period during what we now call the medieval warm, and then a cooling period just following that, the little ice age. So just preceding the little ice age was the medieval warm period. This was a good time for Northern Europeans. Farmers expanded further to the north into higher latitudes because the growing seasons were longer, and arable lands that had previously not been exploitable became wide open, up for grabs. And people in the mountains around the world moved uphill into along altitudinal gradients uphill, because again, those lands that previously could not be farmed became farmable because of an extended growing period. And this had an impact on the natives of our region as well. And it had an impact on the Vikings. So since we're going back in time, this is when the Viking voyages were possible. This is when they were able to sail the North Atlantic around Iceland and across Greenland and establish settlements in Greenland and at L'Anse Meadows and Newfoundland. It was only enabled by climate. And I'm not an environmental or climatic determinist, but we do know from lots and lots of evidence, and just, look at the newspapers or read the news today, and you'll see how climate change is affecting human life. It always has. Now I'm going to go kind of to the other end of our county, out to the Watauga River, Watauga Valley, to talk about migrations from that region. And then I'll return back over to Route 321. This red line, squiggly line, is the Watauga River. And that's part of Watauga County shown there, or that's all of Watauga County. And I did a study one time to try to understand where people were coming from, and to really come up with evidence that people were actually migrating into the high country just prior to that medieval warm period and during that period. And so I looked at the pottery from different rock shelters along the Watauga River. And so up to the upper left, that's the Watauga River flowing downhill into Tennessee. And then it curves around and comes down here to, the Fosco area. And so I looked at the pottery from these rock shelters, and I thought it was interesting that a lot of the pottery had limestone, crushed limestone in the clay. So that was a tempering agent used to control for shrinkage and firing. It also might have had some symbolic element and visual property that the makers of the pottery enjoyed. But this Native American pottery, dating to anywhere from between about probably AD 600 to AD 13 or 1400, has limestone in it. And limestone does not occur in Watauga County. It is found to the west in eastern Tennessee, in the Valley and Ridge Province, where the bedrock geology is almost strictly limestone and dolomite. So very likely this pottery was made in eastern Tennessee, and seasonal migrants who came up the river using it as their trail were sometimes residing in, and for other reasons using these rock shelter sites and leaving pottery behind, broken pottery, that's how we find it, containing the crushed limestone in there as an indication of their origins. It's really doubtful that they would have brought the limestone with them and used it to make the pottery while they were here. So I think this is pottery that was brought with these seasonal migrants coming up the river, very probably in late summer and fall. That is the time, or was at least in pre-contact times, to come up to the high country, because that is when the nuts, especially the chestnuts, are falling. And when the deer are fat and their fur is thick and they are hormonally challenged and easy to hunt. So probably summer, late summer, early fall migrations, people bringing their pottery, using it, breaking it. And the further up the river you go, as you approach Grandfather Mountain, the headwaters of the Watauga, the limestone tempered pottery, as opposed to other kinds of pottery, becomes less and less and less. So I think this is an indication of migration upriver from that valley and ridge province, just prior to and during the medieval warm period. Now, here is some pottery, and it's actually only a couple of these that are limestone tempered. This one in the top middle, where you can see all the holes in the pottery, that's where the limestone is leached out because of acids in the soil around here. There were chunks of limestone in there, but when this pottery is thrown away, the acids in the soil will dissolve the calcium and leave you with the Swiss cheese effect. And this pottery too has the Swiss cheese effect. So that's how we can recognize limestone tempered pottery, not so much by chunks of limestone. And some of those migrants during the medieval warm period, after it warmed up here in the uplands, made the decision to attempt a permanent year-round settlement at the place where Cove Creek flows into Watauga River in western North Carolina. And this is a photo of the second terrace of the Ward site, named after Ray Ward, who owns this property. That's his barn built into the bank there. Archaeologists from ASU did excavations here in the 1970s and into the 80s. And I even did a little bit of work out there in 1990 and combined what was uncovered were a village wall. These little white dots are post holes that are about 3 to 6 inches in diameter where posts had been in the ground. So it's a large rounded village, possibly D-shaped. And inside the village wall were circular houses about 15 to 17 feet in diameter with central fireplaces. This big white blob here marks the central fireplace. And these were double posted walls. So these were substantial weatherproof structures with a heated place in the middle. And probably there were several of these inside the village wall and then the houses surrounding a plaza area. So this is the Ward site, and a few other sites like it are the only evidence we have of Native Americans permanently inhabiting the uplands, and they only exist within this medieval warm period because that was the only time, I think, that they could successfully grow a maize crop and survive as villagers in the uplands. Shortly after this, and by the way, the Ward site, originally they thought it dated to the 1400s AD, but I got better carbon dates on many contexts at this site, and it clearly dates to around 1000 to 1100 AD, so much earlier, but right in the middle of that medieval warm period. A little bit after this site was abandoned, on up to about 1350, we find individual house sites in the mountains, but not villages. So apparently, as the Little Ice Age approached, smaller households, individual farmsteads were able to survive for a while. But then after 1350, those disappear because of the onset of the Little Ice Age. This is some of the pottery from the Ward site. And originally, archaeologists, Bert Purrington and Harvard Ayers, saw similarities between this pottery and pottery found on prehistoric Cherokee sites further to the south. But I disagree, except for these beautiful rim decorations. Those are the only similarities. Every other aspect of the pottery looks more like pottery we see down east on the Piedmont. So I'm really reluctant to call this pre-Cherokee pottery and the Ward site a pre-Cherokee site. So here's that house that was the circular house, post molds forming a circle just inside the palisade wall, which would have been more of a fence, not a fortification, but just something to define the village. And then there's this burned soil from the central fireplace. Here's another shot of that. And these other features might have been food storage pits or some other reason for digging a hole in the ground. And here's an artist's reconstruction of a Native American village, not the Ward site, but a pretty good match for the archaeological evidence there, with circular structures inside the palisade wall and a central plaza for various activities. Now I'm going to move to the other side of Boone and sort of wrap this up. Nowadays, quite a lot of our tourists come up Route 321 from the south, which again follows the headwaters of the Yadkin River, bringing you up into Blowing Rock. And then it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to get over into Boone. So let's do that. Here we are coming into Boone up Route 321. And you all know, you've done this 1,000 times. You pass the incredible toy company, and over here is the golf course. And then you break out into Boone, and there's the hospital. And of course, everybody knows that the ABC store is right there, and Walgreens is right here. So when you come up Route 321/221, which used to be a wagon trail, which used to be a footpath, which follows river courses, you come onto a very, very flat landform here. Here's a topographic map so you can see these 40-foot contours. Essentially, you're coming through a gorge. Now, Spangenberg might have done this in 1751. This might be a place where he stopped and, camped out. Anybody coming up this route in the ancient past, this would have been one of the first very convenient places to establish a camp, because it's on a very flat landform. This is probably the remnant of a debris flow where Yarnell Knob collapsed back during the Ice Age, and then it weathered and sort of flattened out. So this is all a very flat area here where the hospital, the ABC stores, the bank, the CVS Pharmacy, and it commands a tremendous view to the west, north, and east of what I call the Boone Valley, where the headwaters of the New River come together, the Middle Fork and Winkler's Creek and so on. So this would have been an ideal place for people to camp. And in fact, this is looking up at that landform from the Middle Fork River Valley. There's the roof of the hospital there to give you an idea. So if you could jump over this hill, you'd be looking at Boone and Appalachian State University. But it's a very high, flat piece of ground. So it's defensible, it's dry, it commands an amazing view for watching game or the approach of predators or unfriendly humans. Any archaeologist would drive by this place and go, oh God, there's gotta be a site there. And there is. And now the hospital is developing part of this property. There's the CVS Pharmacy there. And I walked around here a week ago, and there are artifacts all over the place. It's all been highly disturbed, excuse me. So this has all been plowed and moved around by bulldozers, but it's full of flint flakes, quartz flakes. Found a couple of spear points in here, burned rocks. And in fact, back in 1995 or 6, this piece of land, or at least the part between Deerfield Road and the Boone ABC store, which you can barely see up in the upper right here, this piece of land, before they built CVS Pharmacy and that bank, I think it's maybe Yadkin Bank, it was for sale for development. And Ray Howells Architects and Associates had a big sign there saying that it was for sale. And they even showed a prospective building to be built there. So I contacted Ray because I knew him, and his daughter was one of our students. And I asked him, could I go out there and do some test excavations with my field school to see if there's anything out there? Because virtually everything in Boone had already been destroyed by buildings and et cetera. And I thought this might be one of the last remaining islands of archaeological evidence from ancient times still preserved in Boone. And he said, yeah, Tom, go for it. See what you can find. And so here's my group out there in the mid 1990s. And we found a place on the site where artifacts were relatively concentrated and where it didn't seem like it had ever been plowed or cultivated or had any real damaging construction. just one small place in the middle of that field. So here's a very crowded field school scene. And immediately below the grass, we found hearths, fireplaces. We found spear points dating back to thousands of years ago, clusters of stone flakes from the making of spear points. We even found building foundations because there were houses on that piece of property up until the 1970s when they all got torn down and removed. But even though those were there, and even though people were playing badminton and croquet and having barbecues in their backyards, all the while just below their feet was archaeological evidence of Native Americans from long ago. We had lots of help on this project. This is Hannah Pertalion. If you know John and Carrington Pertalion, this is their daughter when she was 5. I think she's 30 or 31 now, but she was a great help. And here's our completed excavation in that one little spot. So each of those little squares you see is 1/2 meter. And the earliest, or excuse me, the most recent Native American archaeological evidence we have on this site dates to about 3,700 years ago, or 1,700 BC. And when people came up through Blowing Rock and ultimately down the path that became 321 into Boone, this might be kind of what it looked like. I mean, of course, the mountain and rock formations are a little bit different, but it might have been sort of a mosaic of trees and grasslands. There might have been beaver ponds where the creeks had been dammed up. So this, I like to look at this picture and imagine, okay, this is Boone without Boone. And what an ideal place for camping, especially after traveling up that mountain to get to the high country, to hunt deer, gather nuts, murder turkeys, enjoy life for a couple of months in this area. So we also had Hearth, a fireplace, very well preserved, just below the grass. You can see how deep this is. I mean, we peeled back the grass, scratched a few centimeters of dirt away, and found this hearth. And around it, we found stone tools and flakes. We got some charcoal from this hearth. And Dr. Bill Ward, who used to teach in the English department and also who was a vice chancellor at ASU, he had his son Taylor out here working with us, and found some charcoal in this hearth. And I said, gosh, it sure would be nice to have some money for a carbon date. 2 days later, I got an email from Bill Ward saying, I think I found you some money. I don't know, he probably stole it from some other department, but it's good for archaeology. And also dating to about that time period on this site, we found these artifacts in the circle here. This is a stone knife on the left. We call these Appalachian stemmed knives or Savannah River knives. And then this one is probably an arrow point. And this is about the earliest evidence of bow and arrow technology in the mountains. And I argue about that in my book. And this might be a spear point. This is made of quartz that's a locally abundant material. This is made of yellow jasper that's only found to the west in the Ridge and Valley province. This is Irwin quartzite, which is also found way to the west, 30 kilometers away in the Valley and Ridge province. So it's fun to look at what the artifacts are made of and to use those to conjecture about people's movements. It's unlikely that things like this were traded, or they might have been to some extent, but these are your basic raw materials for making your basic weaponry for hunting. Chances are these materials were obtained by these seasonal migrants when they were in those regions, and they brought these tools, finished tools, and used them along the way, brought them up into what is now Boone, and then broke them and deposited them and replaced them with fresh tools. And that's how we can determine their movements. And this might be what that camp might have looked like 3,700 years ago, with a few temporary structures, a small group of families living here for maybe a few weeks or a couple of months, exploiting the resources within a, maybe a 10 or 20 mile radius, and then moving on to lower elevations. And we found evidence from even further back in time. Right below the grass, we found this cluster of quartz flakes next to some stone tools, such as the ones on the upper right here, that typologically date to between about 6,000 BC and 5,000 BC. And these are made of local materials like quartz, but also cherts and chalcedonies from the Valley and Ridge province to the west. And we also found, dating to that approximate time, part of a spear thrower weight, an atlatl weight, the one in the up number A up here. This is a whole one below that has a hole drilled through it. Here's a fragment where you can see it broke through the hole. So these were spear thrower weights used to propel spears, and they generally predate the use of bows and arrows in our region. And on the bottom right here is a person using a spear thrower with the weight there at mid shaft or maybe a little bit beyond to propel the spear. So this gave extra thrust, extra leverage for more velocity of the spear and more accuracy. We even found earlier evidence at this little site. By the way, we call it the Gwyn Hayes site, named for the original landowner, at least the original landowner whose name was recorded. And the earliest evidence we found here dates to about 9,000 years ago. This is during the end of the Ice Age. And one of the things we found, and we're dating this typologically, meaning that we found similar things on other sites where we got carbon dates, was this Hardaway side notched spear point. So it's only the bottom corner of one. Here's the blade, here's the notch, here's the base. So it would have been symmetrical over here like this. And this is made out of a metavolcanic material from the Carolina Piedmont, about 50 kilometers to the east, southeast. We also found this really big core scraper, which we know these types of artifacts also date to that time, about 9 to 10,000 years ago, or BC, so it's really 11,000 years ago. Very classic late Paleo-Indian artifact, also made out of Carolina metavolcanic materials. So our earliest visitors to this site that we have artifacts that we can date probably came here around 11,000 years ago or 9,000 BC during the late Ice Age. And at that time, Boone would have been a combination of tundra and boreal forest, much different than today. So if they did come up here at that time, and I say if because it's remotely possible that later visitors actually found those artifacts, collected them, and brought them up to Boone. But I kind of doubt it, especially since we have those two. This is the kind of environment they would have encountered. And the place would have been crawling with horses, giant beavers, giant armadillos, possibly saber-toothed cats, mastodons, moose, the Pleistocene fauna of the past and the boreal fauna of the present kind of mixed at this very high elevation. So all along, Boone has been a place of tourism. It's always been called a cultural crossroads, and it still is in many ways. And it's all because of the convergence of these rivers that ultimately created pathways, inroads into this area. And we're able to reconstruct all this movement of these migrants, at least in the ancient past, because of the kinds of rocks that their materials are made out of. I'm getting a strange thing here. And because of the rocks that they've crushed up in their pottery. So this is how we've reconstructed ancient tourism in Boone. And a lot of that is discussed in my book. So that's the end of my show. Thank goodness this thing came up at the end because I can't make it go away. It wants me to restart now. But are there any questions?
Yes, Tom, I have a question.
Yeah.
Who
is
just
that?
a second, Judith. Tom, if we lose you,
Hi, Judith.
I think you can go off and come back on. I'll stay on.
Oh, what do you mean go off
If we
and come
lose
back on?
you, if it times out on you.
Oh, okay. I don't think it will.
Okay.
I understand what you mean. I think we'll be all right. So what was the question, Judith?
One of the maps that you were looking at, early map that showed where they'd settled around Deerfield Road and was just kind of a drawn map. And then off to the right where the valley is, it was called Happy Valley.
Yeah.
And you know anything about, I always think of Happy Valley is down where Patterson is.
Yeah, that's also Happy Valley.
I
But
don't know if you knew any more about that name. I've never heard it, that area referred to as Happy Valley at this point.
yeah, I do not know, but the Middle Fork flows through there. I've even done a little bit of archaeology out there and didn't find anything. And so the locals call it Happy Valley and it shows up on maps, but I have absolutely no idea.
Do they still call it that? Do you know?
I don't know that either.
Okay, just curious. Okay. It's very interesting. Thank you.
And if you think of questions later, you can always find me at whitetr@appstate.edu. And I'm sure Cheryl can pass that on to you if you forget. But
Tom?
hi, Sue.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I remember you talking about wanting to write a book like this. I don't know, maybe 20 years ago.
That's probably when I started on it.
So I'm really glad to see it's out and I have a copy and I look forward to delving into it in detail. But thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'll follow that up, Tom. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Tom. I also have the book and I've been really enjoying the first part. I'm delving into it. And I can sure see how much of a teacher you are by the book, just laying things out in the way you do. It's just wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, years ago when my office was close to yours and I was, catching a little bit of archaeology as I walked onto my classroom while you were teaching.
It tends to get on you, especially your clothes.
Yeah. And you convinced me that this was not a Cherokee area per se back then. But my question has to do with the Cherokee, and because I know that they are somehow related to the Iroquois people way up north. And I was wondering, is there any evidence of them passing through here?
Well, obviously you haven't gotten to chapter 6.
No.
I forget which chapter that is. Well, as you go further back in time, where I need to send you an article I wrote on Iroquois divergence in the Southern Appalachians, where I look at the archaeological evidence, the linguistic evidence, and the biological evidence of the divergence of the Cherokee from the Northern Iroquois in probably around 3,000 years ago. And so if you go back to the archaeological evidence from about 3,000 years ago, there's a lot of remarkable similarity between technologies, burial patterns, and other things extending from northern New York all the way down into the Southern Appalachians. Mm-hmm. And then after that, we start to see major differences and more geographic separation. So at that point, it looks like, yeah, there might be evidence of a proto-Iroquois covering the whole Appalachian chain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, though, when I look at the recent evidence, like at the Ward site, and the latest evidence of humans residing up here, at the Ward site and site same age around AD 1000, really the material culture anyway looks much more similar to the material culture of groups living on the Piedmont at that time. And we know that the Piedmont is the area where the Siouan-speaking Indians ultimately resided, at least in historic times. So I haven't seen, Cherokee material culture that we can link with the Cherokee language is koala pottery. It's a distinctive type of pottery. Not one piece of koala pottery has been found in Watauga County. Mm-hmm. So the Cherokees, of course, claimed this area, and it was bought from the Cherokees, by the whites. And the Royce map shows this is Cherokee Territory. And certainly the Cherokees passed through here and knew about it and may have claimed it, but there's no evidence that they ever lived here or even camped out here substantially. So, mm-hmm. and of course, this has opened up a whole can of worms with with territorial acknowledgements that are really popular these days. Everybody wants to call ASU Cherokee Territory, and I'm sorry, I think that's really nice, but a nice gesture, but we might be giving it away to the wrong people.
Right, right. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's good. I look forward to that chapter.
Okay.
I have a question about the houses. Post holes are pretty obvious, but then what are the posts holding up? When I saw the substantial double walled, I thought, aha, wattle and daub. But the pictures, your illustrations seem to be showing woven mats. So what do you think the houses were walled with?
That's a good question, Linda. Now, of course, the site had been plowed, and so all of the original surface of that village had been churned up, but the excavations didn't turn up much in the way of daub. Very little daub.
Ah,
But I know what you mean about the way that the posts are set. You would think that they would have been vertical walls supporting, roof rafters, and then, wattling and daubing. And of course, that would make sense for a winter house. So I
yeah.
think that's extremely possible. So, maybe I didn't choose the best picture to represent what the ward site looked like, or maybe I should have shown two, because I think it's equally possible that they were wattle and daub structures.
Question about the area where the hospital has leveled out.
Yeah.
Is that site worth investigating, or would there be time before they build?
Well, I went out there and they've dug some big holes. And I also noticed that it had already been plowed as well. So I think it would be a really fun artifact mine, but of very little information potential. So I'm not inclined to go through the hassle of contacting the hospital and saying, hey, could you stop what you're doing and give me time to do some explorations there? But so I think since the contexts have been destroyed, there's really not much of a reason to go out there. It would just be more artifacts that would add little more to the story.
So Tom, if we don't give it to the Cherokee, who do we give ASU to? What is there, a tribe?
How about just Native Americans that may include the Cherokee, may include ancestors of the Catawba? I think maybe a more general attribution like that would be safer and more accurate.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I have a friend that lives in Boone. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and I've been listening to you, and it's just fascinating. And I'd really love to know about Richmond and the area around here. Now, we still have Indian tribes here, of course.
Yeah.
But we have a Virginia museum. I'm a docent at the museum, and we have an exhibit called Arcadia that just opened. And we used Jefferson's father's map to show everyone where it was and how it happened. And of course, it was all like 1700 and beyond, that area. But it's very fascinating what you've been talking about. But who would I talk to about the same kind of thing here around Richmond?
Well, you're really lucky, because the Virginia Department of Historic Resources is right there in Richmond, with a staff of archaeologists who are all good friends of mine, and
all right, thank you.
Wonderful people, yeah. So just look up the VDHR online.
Okay.
And gosh, you'll find a wealth of information
All right.
as far as contacts. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have there been surveys done on the Blair farm? The only farm left in that area of Boone.
Yes, Linda, I did an archaeological survey on the Blair farm, and we did some shovel test pits and did find evidence of course, the history of the Blair farm, but also found a Native American campsite right out in the front yard, dating to the early woodland period. So probably around maybe about 500 to 200 BC.
Wow.
Mhm. Well, if that's, are there any other questions?
Tom, I'm trying to think if we've got the historic report of the Ward site, an electronic version. Do you?
I scanned it. I've got a PDF of that.
So
Yeah.
if people, you could send it to me if you don't want to be bothered with it. If people want a report that I had students do on the historic component of the Ward Farm site,
Yeah.
we could
Yeah.
send that out to you.
Yeah, and I agree with you and John Mintz that that was probably Benjamin Ward's house of the late 18th century, built right smack dab on top of the Native American village site there. Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to do that, Cheryl. I'm pretty sure I scanned that, so I'll check my other computer in a while, and if I have it, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
One last one.
Okay.
No koala pottery here, but what about Catawba pottery?
Oh, well, Burke series pottery, which is arguably pre-contact and early historic Catawba. Well, the Catawba didn't exist with that name, really until the Confederacy joined up in the 17th, 18th century. But Burke series pottery is probably proto-Catawba. It's Siouan speaking pottery. That's the kind of pottery they have at the Barry site, dating to the 16th century. That's the kind of pottery that's found in the real Happy Valley, where the Nelson Mound group, dating to the 16th century, exists. So Burke series pottery does show up in the mountains here. I find it only a piece here and there, like in a rock shelter, one piece on a campsite. So no Burke phase proto-Siouan villages up here, but they were definitely coming up here during the Little Ice Age, probably in the 15th, 16th century, and at least leaving a smattering of pottery behind.
Tom, the Cherokee have had some success making claims to West Virginia and Kentucky occupations. What's your opinion about that?
Well, if I was given the opportunity, I'd claim all those states too. Not to belittle them, and they might have some legitimate claim as far as something that took place in the past. But groups throughout time and throughout space have tended to claim a little bit beyond into other people's territories and to claim lands that other people would have claimed. That's an interesting debate and an interesting topic. And of course, there are maps, again, like the Royce map, where basically they interviewed the Cherokees and they said, what was your former territory? And they looked at the map and they went, oh, all of this, And I like the solid evidence, and I'm looking for the archaeological evidence. Show me the koala pottery. That would be a good start. And I don't think it exists up there. Not that, the Cherokees only made koala pottery, but at least those middle and out town Cherokees did in southwestern North Carolina. So I really don't want to go there. In fact, that's dangerous territory. That gets way political, and I sure didn't get into archaeology for that reason.
Hey, Tom, one more little question.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, sure.
It's just okay. Who is Norman Dean Jefferson, who you dedicated the
He was
memory of?
he was my best friend, and we shared houses together and went to school together for years. And he taught me how to make stone tools, and so he was my best friend. And he committed suicide in 1998, and I really haven't gotten over it. So since he influenced my career so much, I decided to dedicate my book to him.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Well, while we're on the topic of the Cherokee, we have a tribal employee who will be speaking to our group the third Tuesday in April. It's either the second or the third Tuesday in April. So you'll be getting notices about that too. Any other questions for Dr. Whyte? All right, well, thank you very much, Tom. And I've got this recorded. I'll be sending the recording out to the mailing list. So
Okay.
if that's all right with you, actually, I should ask you. If you,
Wait, you didn't get me sipping my beer, did you?
no.
Okay. No, that's fine. And it's so good to see all of you. So many familiar faces. I miss you. One of these days, right?
Yeah.
Good to see you, Tom.
All
Thank
right,
you,
thanks.
Tom.
Thank you, Tom. It was great.
Thank you.
And anybody
Thanks,
who wants a
Tom.
copy of the Ward site, the historic component to that site, send me an email and I'll get you one.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks.
All right, Tom. See you later.